Richmond Refrains devotional number 3, October 10th, 2019. Gospel proclamation in a world of action. As I walked out of McDonald's after our afternoon Bible study, I struck up a conversation with the young man standing outside. As we sipped our sweet tea and said hello to the other patrons walking in, we talked about the crazy heat we'd been having, the wisdom of Samuel in the Bible, the difficulties of entering life again after a prison sentence and losing all of your IDs, and about pastors who drive nice cars but don't give money to people on the side of the road. As I left McDonald's and came home, I thought about our conversation and the role of the church and how we can embody the gospel through our actions. Then the next weekend, Kendra and I packed up and headed down to Raleigh to attend the No Place Left conference on evangelism and multiplication of disciples of Jesus. I left this conference thinking about how we can do more than just embody the gospel, but how we can also share the freedom that Christ brings with our words. As I reflect on these two happenings, I'm struck by the difficulty that this tension of embodiment and proclamation brings. For much of my life, I lived by the quote misattributed to St. Francis of Assisi: "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." End quote. I thought that to verbally share the gospel with others who didn't explicitly ask about it would just be a nuisance and would push people further away. I thought that all I should do was to live out the gospel with my life, and people would be drawn in and ask about it. Living that experiment for most of a decade, I can count exactly 2 times that this actually happened. That I had actually had people ask me about why I lived the way I did. However, just in the last year of living in Richmond, I run out of fingers and maybe even toes as I count up the number of people who have genuinely been interested in the gospel of Jesus Christ and the impact it has on our lives as I'm more verbal about the gospel. And I'm still learning how to share the gospel truthfully and meaningfully in our context, but I've noticed a lot of interest. And looking back at the book of Acts, we see the early church showing a balance of this tension between embodiment and proclamation. As they met daily in the temple to worship together in Acts 2:46, they helped heal the sick in Acts 2:43 and 3:7, and they were intentional about spreading their resources so no one in their fellowship would go hungry. Acts 2 verse 44 to 45. They embodied the gospel. But then they also proclaimed the gospel in the midst of a large crowd in Acts 2 verse 14 to 41. This cycle of Christian life, embodiment and proclamation, is often repeated throughout Acts as missionaries are sent out to plant new churches around the Mediterranean, living out the gospel in the midst of day-to-day life, but also proclaiming the good news of salvation through Christ to all who would listen. As I was contemplating all this, Sean Benesh from Intrepid sent an email out about a 3-part series of articles he had just posted on presence and proclamation, which further propelled me to think about this tension. These two ideas of embodiment and proclamation should run hand in hand, but we all too often lean more heavily on one or the other. As we work for justice in the world and embody the gospel, we should also recognize that a lasting justice will only come through the transformation that Christ brings. As we share the gospel with others, we should also remember that God sides with the oppressed over and over in the Bible, and that Jesus lifted up the poor and sinners throughout his ministry, and that he calls us to do the same. We should not neglect proclamation in order to lift up justice, embodiment, and neither should we ignore the needs of justice when we share the gospel. The two run hand in hand. Now, there will inevitably be times where the most appropriate response is simply embodiment or simply proclamation. But the gospel of Christ is multifaceted. Justice is only lasting through Christ's transformation. And the gospel is so powerful that justice just happens. So turning our gaze now to practically applying this in our lives, here are a few questions for your pondering. What were specific instances in the last month where I could have proclaimed the gospel more? What were specific instances in the last month where I could have embodied the gospel more? And what are regular occurrences in my weekly schedule where gospel proclamation and gospel embodiment go hand in hand? Until next time, grace and peace.